Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful individual and society lecture. Today, we're focusing on the first part of our chapter three book content, which is really exciting for me because this is focusing on symbolic interactionism, which is the um, face of sociological social psychology that I enjoy the most. I enjoy all the faces of sociological social psychology because, in some way or another, they're looking at how stable structures shape components of the self and how that in turn shapes behaviors. But I enjoy symbolic interactionism the most because it gets to the most fundamental elements of how human beings interact in a society, which is the the premise that symbolic interactionists operate on is that society is the result of people creating meanings and then sharing those meanings through language to the point where we can evoke in another the same sort of response that we evoke in ourselves through language. I'll explain that phrase a little bit more when we get to the slide on Mead, but um, I don't know. I feel like symbolic interactionism gets at something a little bit more philosophically, a little philosophically deeper regarding the human experience. Just because it's not just saying that these are the ways in which we're embedded in structure. It's saying here's the way in which human interaction in society is shaped through our own mental processes and how that is connected to existing social structures. I'm probably just confusing everyone a little bit more than I'm actually clarifying. So let's go ahead and get into things. And that way we'll have some slides to help focus my interest in what I'm specifically talking about. So first thing, just as a reminder, whenever we're talking about symbolic interactionism, and then even within symbolic interactionism, there's various sorts of disciplines that have their own sort of sub-frameworks um, that operate within the larger tent of just symbolic interactionism. We'll get into that, the idea of the Chicago school and the Indiana school. But the idea of symbolic interactionism and its specific subdisciplines are theoretical frameworks or theoretical perspectives. These are ways of viewing the social world and the complex interactions that occur in there. Um, by providing researchers with a set of concepts and specifying how these concepts are related. So it's a framework for understanding a certain number of key ideas, key concepts, key principles, and then proposing the ways in which these should be related to one another. It's not necessarily testing how specific variables are correlated or whether they have a causal effect. It's talking a bit broader than that. Um, for example, a theoretical framework within structural symbolic interactionism is the idea that self reflects society. So, in that, we would go ahead and clarify what we mean by this large concept of self, which we'll actually do in a little bit. And then we'll also be identifying what we mean by society, which in this case would be that complex set of institutions and stable meanings and expectations that propagate through a collective group of humans over time, with some other important caveats. So it defines the concepts and it proposes a general understanding of how the social world operates relative to these concepts. So self reflects society. That is to say, the um, properties of the social environment in which you are located will have a determining factor in terms of the components of yourself that are, the components of yourself and how important or how relevant those components are in various situations. So the idea is if you're around people who are religious, your society, your social structures are that you are around religious people. Therefore, yourself will reflect this in terms of how you think of yourself as religious, how you define situations as being relevant to religion, how you interpret situations as being open or closed to the enactment of the religious identity. That's all things that we would actually test um, with specific theories. But what I've just outlined is a framework within which those theories arise. So a framework, this is now focusing more on what the book's saying. A framework is more specific than a face, which largely focuses on research traditions or orientation. So symbolic interactionism has the research tradition of examining how humans create meaning, share meaning, and then how interactions are predicated based upon these meanings, these understandings of the situation. Then, within any given phase of social psychology, there are coexisting frameworks that share common assumptions, and because they're located within the same phase, they often share methodological predispositions. Not always. For example, within symbolic interactionism, uh, Chicago school SI is going to be more qualitative, but Indiana school um, SI is going to be a bit more quantitative. It uses a lot of survey research, not really experiments, but um, Indiana school symbolic interactionism or structural symbolic interactionism does tend to use surveys more because it's trying to examine not just components of the self, but the social structures in which that self is nested. All right, now that I've managed to go ahead and talk forever on a slide with only 3 bullet points, let's continue. So, just as a refresher, what is symbolic interactionism? And, we're covering this again, even though we talked about it in our first chapter, just to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what this thing is before we try and delve into specifics about it and the ideas that are contained within this phase of sociological social psychology. So, symbolic interactionism is a face of social psychology that emphasizes communication and the social construction of meaning traditionally through face to face interactions. Here's the big things coming out of that, right? Symbolic interactionism focuses on the fact that meanings just don't exist naturally in nature. They are things that we construct. Importantly, these meanings that we use to, to understand the social world and the world at large come about through communication and interaction. The idea is that we assign meaning to things and then we develop language as a way to share those meanings because only with shared meanings can you have stable, reliable sets of interaction patterns. The idea is that we as humans want the ability to have some sort of sense. We want to be able to predict to a limited degree what is going to happen in an interaction because if we can't do that and everything is considered, possible or probable within that interaction, it becomes hard to go ahead and determine what response you will have in that situation ahead of time. There's no way to prep for it. You just basically would be in a constant state of reacting, um, which is kind of how Mead frames the difference between non-human animals and humans in original SI research. So we assign meanings to the social world. These meanings are important because they help us understand what to expect in the world, and it's important that we're able to share these meanings because that is what makes stable social interaction possible. So research within this frame is often, the traditional school definitely is referred to as microsociology because it focuses at the level of the individual and face-to-face interactions, right? And even in the structural paradigm, the focus is still the fact that people create and act upon meanings, and those meanings are what shape how interactions unfold. It's just in later iterations of symbolic interactionism, there's this interest on how are the meanings brought to the situation, the stable sets of meanings shaped by the social structure that they are nested within. But traditionally, we think of SI as microsociology due to the focus at the level of the individual and face to face interactions. Meanings are not something that just exist, they are created and recreated through interactions because no interaction is perfectly defined. So there's always a degree of trying to interpret what meanings are relevant and understanding what expectations there are for behavior. So, SI, microsociology, focuses on the individual and the face to face interactions through which meanings are created and recreated over time. There are three main theoretical frameworks within the symbolic interactionist base of sociology. Remember, frameworks are uh, a set of concepts and a specification of how these concepts are related. The three major frameworks the book wants you to be aware of whenever it comes to symbolic interactionism as a face of social psychology are symbolic interactionism, dramaturgical approach, and ethnomethodology. It's a little bit weird how they frame this. Remember, this is how the book is framing it, right? This is how things will be evaluated in the examination. But it's really weird to lump SI as a framework in with dramaturgical approach and ethnomethodology because dramaturgical approach and ethnomethodology are pretty much like data collection methods, whereas symbolic interactionism is supposed to be a framework that guides our development of theoretical explanations of the social world, whereas dramaturgical approach and ethnomethodology are frameworks explaining how we should collect data on the social world in alignment with this theoretical framework we're interested in developing and then testing. But as far as the book's concerned, there are three main theoretical frameworks within SI. These three frameworks are symbolic interactionism as a framework, most prominent with two schools of thought within symbolic interactionism. Then we have dramaturgical approach and ethnomethodology. We'll be focusing on those latter two probably in the second lesson. We'll definitely be going through most of the symbolic interactionism component in this first lesson. So with that said, let's go to the root of symbolic interactionism. This is actually before the term had been coined, but this is pretty much where all symbolic interactionists point to as one of the main um, like founders of the school of thought. Even though he didn't directly like name it symbolic interactionism, the principles that Mead outlines in his it's not his recordings. He didn't actually write Mind, Self, and Society. Mind, Self, and Society is a collection of like lectures he gave and other notes that his students took. But I'm pretty sure Mead didn't actually write Mind, Self, and Society himself. But anyway, Mead is someone whose ideas became very foundational to all symbolic interactionism, whether you're in the later Chicago or Indiana schools of thought. So the book, I would say, correctly says that Mead is the most significant contributor to the symbolic interactionist framework. There are some people that you could consider having come before Mead to limited degrees, like Thomas James. I'm pretty sure. No, no, it wasn't James who talked about the looking glass self. What did he say? I'll have to look that up actually later, and maybe I'll put it in the comments with this video. But I do remember Cooley was in, I think, 1904, and he was the person who coined the term looking glass self, which then Mead incorporates. So there were people who informed this budding framework, this SI framework before Mead, but he's pretty much the point to where things really started to gain traction and then were crystallized into a larger set of principles versus these ideas, which were a little bit more scattershot. You could do a whole course on just SI, so I'll try and leave it there. In the collection of writings, the book that was later published called Mind, Self, and Society, we have Mead arguing that people communicate through the exchange of significant symbols. So here's a couple of ideas that that Mead argues that are fundamental to how human beings act collectively, right? Because Mead was operating largely from a behavioral psychology standpoint. And so his point is that human beings, because they have very, very complex thought, right? They're not necessarily temporally bound with their thinking. They're able to imagine things in the future, and they're able to hold objects uh, and ideas in their minds, right? Because of this, because humans are able to think about things in advance, and because they're able to think about complex ideas, they're able to envision a number of situations in which various outcomes could occur. In order to control these sorts of outcomes, especially whenever it comes to interacting with another human, we attempt to communicate a set of meanings with the other person. So, what does it mean to communicate meanings in the median sense? Whenever I say I'm communicating a meaning, I mean that I am evoking through something I do, often through a word I say, not because the word innately has some association with meaning, but because over time it has become through interaction, there's been this establishment of an idea with a series of sounds known as a word. But the idea is meaning in this context is I'm able to, through doing something like saying a word, I'm able to elicit within you the same mental response that I would elicit within myself. What does that mean? If I need to communicate with you in such a way to where I'm directing you to sit down in a chair, right? I need you to be sitting, and I need you to not be sitting on the floor, we'll say is the idea. So I need to communicate with you that there's this thing that I'm identifying as a chair, and I need you to recognize it in the same fashion. Whenever I say chair, I need us both to be picturing the same idea, the same action, the same noun, the same verb. I need to cause you to be thinking about the same thing that I'm thinking about. Because in that way, we can be somewhat in each other's minds and develop expectations for how an interaction will occur. So we act on these meanings. Whenever I see a chair, right? I could have three things in the front of the classroom where other people are seeing me. I have a chair, I have a desk, and I have a stool, like a little footstool. I could sit on all three of those. But because I have attached meaning to these objects, and I know other people think or have a general sort of idea about these objects the same way I do, I'm going to act towards these objects based on their meaning. I'm going to sit in the chair because I have labeled it as chair and because I have a set of ideas associated with that meaning, with that term, right? A chair is a thing to sit upon in neutral social company. A table is a thing to set objects other than yourself upon in this example. So we communicate and act on meanings. Now, how do we convey meanings? Mead argues that we do so with significant symbols. There's a bit of division in his work early on, differentiating between what is a gesture and what is a significant symbol. Um, We don't need to get into gestures. They're supposed to be a little bit more rudimentary. It's a mental exercise of what a society looked like whenever it was just starting to formulate language. But a significant symbol is largely what I was talking about in terms of meaning. It is a thing that calls forth a response in you as it does in my mind. So if I raise my hand in the classroom, that I recognize the person who's initiating this action, that I'm trying to get your attention. But a raised hand to you, at least I'm operating under this assumption here, I'm assuming that you also know that a raised hand means I want attention. And I'm doing this because based upon that understanding, you, the teacher, will call upon me, the student, if I raise my hand. So that raising of a hand would be considered a significant symbol. That's a very base example, but it's easier because it's a clear physical sort of action, right? That might be closer to what Mead was talking about gestures. Um, it's still, as the book outlines, a significant symbol, but that sort of base physical action could somewhat be could be close to a gesture. Language, though, language is always composed of significant symbols. For example, the word tree, that set of sounds that I just made into the microphone that you hear as the word tree, there's nothing in those sounds that naturally will cause an uninitiated human to picture tree, right? If I were to take someone who uh, who was from another who had either no language, if that would even be possible with a human, um, or someone who doesn't speak my language. We'll say someone who's completely outside of the language family that I'm speaking. And I say tree, that will not conjure forth the image of a tree in their mind because that set of sounds has no innate connection to that object and to the meanings that would be interacting on. Over time, a society, through a set of interactions, comes to establish a certain set of significant symbols as representing various abstract sort of thoughts or objects. That's the big thing about language. That's one of the most powerful things about humans is that we can, through using language, cause another being to be thinking about the same thing we're thinking about. You can't do that with your cat by and large. Like maybe you can now because you've classically conditioned them. Whenever you say treat, they know food. But the larger set of meanings about treat, like whenever you say treat versus food, as a human, because those two significant symbols have slightly varied meanings, we know that treat doesn't just mean, here's just something that you can eat. It means this is something that you can eat that is slightly tastier than what you normally have and isn't supposed to be eaten regularly, but is a special sort of occasion reward sort of item. The idea is your cat's not thinking that. Your cat is responding to the classic conditioning of, they say treat, I receive a delicious thing to eat, and I'm now paying attention to that. Going back to what I was saying earlier, because we have this ability to think into the future, right? I can think about what my interaction with my students tomorrow in class will be like before I'm ever there. And because we have this ability to engage in the sharing of language, human beings can engage in very complicated set of planning and interaction and stable sets of interaction patterns because we're able to both think abstractly and communicate with another and know that the other will be able to communicate back with us. So, touched on two things the book wanted to. Right. The other thing the book wants to make sure I touch on, I would have forgotten this because I was so absorbed in the idea of getting to language. The idea is that symbolic communication occurs both within and between individuals. So let's go back to this sort of planning thing, right? I can plan I know that I'm going to be teaching tomorrow, right? And I know I'm going to be interacting with students. I can, as a human, at least after a certain developmental age, I am able to go ahead and imagine myself in that situation. And because there's shared meanings, I can imagine how my audience might react. So whenever I'm planning how I'm going to interact with my students in class tomorrow, I'm able to imagine, okay, if I walk in and say, "Good morning, class," what are they going to do based upon what I understand the shared meanings and expectations in the situation are? That is not perfectly defined. Like, there are some meanings that say everyone will respond, but there are other meanings which say, this is an instructor just walking in. He doesn't really care, so I'm only going to get a half-hearted response. I have to work through that. I have to try and assess what line of response is most probable. But this internal monologue I'm having with myself, me pretending to be me in a future situation, and then me mentally pretending to be my students in the situation so I can imagine how that exchange would go, is how humans develop complex thought. We're able to not only imagine future situations and not only exchange meanings in current situations, but because an exchange of meanings is possible in our minds, we can take the position of the other and try and imagine how they would react to us. I'll go a little bit farther in the slides, but Mead uses baseball as a good example of how this um, ability to step into the mind of the other informs stable interaction patterns. final point is that within Mead and his writing, the self is what is known as the capacity for complex thought that emerges as children develop. So the self is the capacity for complex thought as children develop. Here being, complex thought being the ability of individuals to converse with themselves. They're able to take the position of another person in their mind and imagine how a situation would play out. Later on, this idea of self will become expanded. Um, One common definition of the self now is everything that one can call one's own, um, which is a lot broader, but it needed to broaden. We'll talk about that when we get to the self concept. But in this original idea, the self is your capacity for complex thought, with complex thought being your ability to converse with themselves. The idea is you see yourself as a self, as an individual. And the phrasing is you are able to take yourself as an object unto yourself. You're able to imagine yourself in a future situation from the mindset of someone else in that situation. You're able to imagine being that other person watching you. All right, let's move on. So let's delve in into a little bit more of the median self. And here is where I'm going to kind of talk about the baseball example that I mentioned. So the concept of the self is central to all symbolic interactionist work, whether Chicago or Indiana school, traditional or structural, all symbolic interactionism is concerned with the self. Self reflects society, behavior is dependent on self. Behavior reflects self, reflects society. Behavior, say, my propensity to talk about religious matters, reflects self, which, I might have a very religious self. I might strongly see myself as a Christian, and self reflects society. If I am surrounded by Christian institutions and individuals, I will be more likely to see myself as a Christian, which means I will be more likely to act in various ways in various situations. So the self is central to all symbolic interactionism. Mead talks about the self as this process of interaction between two phases, the I phase and the me phase. The I phase is the subjective phase of the self. It's the individual's spontaneous reaction to people, situations, and events. The me is the object phase. It allows for self reflection and evaluation through the process of role taking. I do this. I am hungry. I am tired. I am cranky. I am going to throw a punch at this person's face. These are all from my own perspective, looking out from my own eyes. It's how I am feeling towards other people. The me phase, which takes longer to develop, young children, Mead argues, almost immediately develop an I phase. You could almost say they're born with it. They have spontaneous reactions to people, situations, and events. The me phase is where you start thinking about yourself as an object unto yourself. The me phase allows for self reflection and evaluation through role taking. Whenever you develop the me phase, you now are not just looking through your own eyes, you are pretending to look at yourself through someone else's eyes. This is what they think of me, right? This is how others would describe me versus I am the one feeling this. So let's talk about role taking real fast from the book's outline, and then I'll mention this in the context of baseball. 'Cause I really think that sport is one that is well suited to connecting with this very base level understanding of symbolic exchange and interaction. So, Mead said it's during the me phase that you develop the ability to role take or perspective take. Role taking involves viewing oneself as an object from the perspective of another individual, group, or society at large. If you have someone else in mind, like I'm in a family setting, right? And I'm imagining interacting with my grandmother. And I'm looking at myself through what I imagine are her eyes, her feelings, her mindset, right? That's not necessarily a generalized other, but I'd still be doing that. And that is why I might refrain from swearing at that family gathering, because as I'm looking at myself through her eyes and imagining what her thought process is, I would come to the conclusion that she will not view this favorably. And so I would refrain from the interaction. I would refrain from swearing. Um, However, if you don't have a specific person in mind necessarily, but you are making reference to, well, there are certain standards of behavior that are just common in society at large. So if you're role taking whenever you're at the supermarket, if you're at the gas station and you're standing in line and you are singing top of your lungs out loud with earbuds in your ear, right? You're ideally you should be imagining, all right, how would some rando behind me view this? And then on reflection, you should ideally come to the conclusion that, this will not be viewed favorably. Maybe I should refrain from doing this, right? Of course, not everyone does do that because there's an interpretation process here where whenever people are trying to access the generalized other, whenever they're trying to get in the mindset of this random standing behind them, they might not actually perceive like, this random would view my actions negatively. But whenever you're trying to step behind the eyes of just a random person, not a specific other, we call this the generalized other, where you are planning your behavior in reference to like just common societal expectations or what you perceive as common societal expectations. And I want to reiterate, all of this is happening within your own mind. You're not actually interacting with this other person yet. This is your mental imagining of how the situation would play out. So you're still limited in your ability to role take based upon your knowledge, your awareness, your ability to like empathize with another person. It's important to reference that because it's easy to think about how an interaction would go and then imagine that that is how it would play out in your mind. But how it plays out in your mind is fundamentally limited by your own thought processes and the total pool of information you have. With that said, though, it is role taking that makes social interaction possible because it allows us to get a sense of others' expectations for us and allows us to coordinate behaviors and construct further meanings. If we weren't able to role take, we wouldn't be able to plan out how others would interact with us in the future in complex interactions. And therefore, we wouldn't be able to have efficient exchanges of ideas and then cooperation towards a task. It is our ability to role take that allows us to enter a situation in which we can communicate meanings and then engage in some sort of collective task. This is why humans can build things, really complex things, is because we have the ability to role take and we have meanings. And together, these things allow us to communicate and create a shared plan for future interactions. So, how's this work? In the baseball example. So, baseball is a good example of the generalized other, or in this case, just imagining the position of the other, because everyone in baseball is supposed to have a pretty clearly designated role. So, if you're the pitcher, everyone on your team knows that you are going to be throwing the ball towards the catcher. No one's going to be caught off guard by that. And everyone also knows that um, people can steal from bases, right? They can, you don't have to wait for the pitch, you can run. So if I'm a first baseman and I know this, and I know the pitcher's going to throw, and I know my guy who's on first could try and steal to second, I'm going to be imagining, all right, what is he going to be doing? And is he going to run? And I'll be basing my behavior on what I think he is likely to do relevant to when the pitch is going to be thrown. Um, a better example would be this. I'm a first baseman, right? And I know that if the ball gets hit towards shortstop, it is the job of the player on shortstop or on third base to get the ball and throw it to me. Because I have that expectation, when I see that the ball is hit towards third base, I already have a plan of action for myself in mind. I am going to do what everyone else is expecting of me as the first baseman. And there's this shared understanding on the team that as the first baseman, if someone gets a ground hit to third, and there's no one else on base, that the first baseman will put their foot on first base and catch the ball from the teammate. So I understand, one, what others are doing, and two, I understand what others expect of me to do. So that without actually communicating after the ball is hit, as soon as we see that the ball is going towards third base, we don't have to, yell at each other like, okay, you catch the ball, and then I will stand on first, and then I will catch the ball when you throw it to me. We've already planned this out in our own minds because we're able to understand the expectations of others because of their social position and understand expectations for ourselves because of our social position. That's the big thing, or one of the biggest things is these sets of meanings, right, are in many ways tied to social positions. That will become much more relevant later. So I'm not taking the mind of the third baseman as Jim, the baseball player. I'm taking the position of, all right, what will Jim, the third baseman, do as third baseman with the set of expectations based upon what a third baseman is. And I understand that Jim or Fred or whoever's playing third base, if they have a grounder hit to them and there's no one else on base and I'm the first baseman, they're going to get it and throw it to me. Very, very small. But now take this and apply this to any other positional designations. Private and corporal sergeant, teacher and student, employer, employee, boyfriend, girlfriend, mother, son, mother, father, husband, wife. Um, um, I'm starting to blank now, but a police officer and citizen. We're not just trying to role take in the mind in these cases of just some idiosyncratic person. We're trying to get in the mindset of someone who occupies a position. And as we're trying to occupy the mindset of someone holding this position, part of taking it over their mindset is realizing that they know what is expected of them in their position, and they're going to try and act relative towards that. I think maybe there I might have strayed a little bit too far. Um, so if anything there was just starting to throw you for a loop and you'd like me to clarify it a little bit further, let me know, and I will either post a clarification or I might make a short, like 3 5 minute follow-up video on your specific point. So let's talk just a little bit more about this idea of self and behavior. So I've already touched on this a little bit based on what I was saying, but let's make sure we cover the key points that the book wants to highlight. So with any social context, social behavior is viewed as a product of interaction between the I and the me. The individual reacts with the I and immediately assesses the appropriateness of their response by viewing themselves through the eyes of others. The me redirects or shapes the I, bringing behaviors into line with expectations of others and society. Basically, you go, what should I do in this situation? Well, what do these people expect of me? Okay, based on that, here is what I am going to do. Due to the I, behavior is never completely predetermined. Even if you're trying to get into the mindset of another individual, because the I is somewhat spontaneous and because the I is not perfectly in accordance with what you imagine the expectations are of others, behavior is never predetermined. You always have to do some level of interpreting or responding to situations in unique ways. The idea is the extent to which the me shapes the I depends on the social context. If you have really formal, structured situations like a baseball team, the me largely shapes the actions of the I because the meanings and expectations in that situation and the positions those expectations are attached to are a lot more clearly defined, and the scope in which outside meanings can enter is very, very narrow. It's a very controlled environment. In informal, unstructured situations, you're going to have the I have more of an effect on behavior because your ability to really get into the mindset of others and feel confident that you have a perfect understanding of the situation, so do they, results in unique spontaneous behavior on the part of the I because it doesn't have a perfect understanding of how it should behave. The idea also is that with with close friends, you understand each other really well, even in unstructured situations, right? You understand each other, you know each other really well, so you have a good idea how they're thinking about you in a variety of situations where you're both students, where you're both civilians in a car and you've been pulled over by the police, where you're both patrons at an amusement park. Even in these various situations with more or less structured meanings, you and your friend have enough personal history to easily be able to get behind each other's eyes, regardless of the situation that arises in those contexts. So, the me, how your friend is thinking about you, is going to have a greater impact on the behavior of the I than if you're in any of those situations with a stranger, especially like in these informal and structured situations. If you have a friend in those situations, at least you have the ability to get behind your friend's eyes, you would think, because you understand them so well. If it's a stranger, you have no set meanings from the situation and you have no history with this individual to help you get behind their eyes. And so in these cases, the I will have a much greater impact on shaping behavior. You're largely just acting upon how I think about this. I want to do this. I'm feeling this way, and not this is how this other person is thinking about me, and this is what they are expecting of me. So this was all median SI. Okay. By median, I mean these were the ideas that were outlined by George Herbert Mead. Didn't necessarily write them all down like this. And he didn't coin the term symbolic interactionism, right? It was his student, Herbert Bloomer, who actually coined the term symbolic interactionism and helped set out some premises of this framework. So Mead has this long-winded discussion of like, what is the self? Like, what is this thing that helps direct human behavior? And that is largely what the texts are absorbed in, is just what is this thing? What is the self? That's why he gets into things like the I and the me and the sharing of meanings. Bloomer is talking about the symbolic interactionist perspective. So his work is now offering a more concrete framework that would help orient future development of theory and research questions. So we have Mead in 1934, and then in 1969, we have Bloomer publishing his large text where he outlines three premises of the symbolic interactionist perspective. So, what are these three premises of SI? Which it's kind of interesting because there were a series of back and forth debates as to whether these premises inherently mean that symbolic interactionism can't look at structure and can't use things like surveys. The ultimate conclusion was saying that these premises like basically forbid the use of surveys of quantitative data or looking at structure is a misreading of them. It's a fundamental misreading of them, and it's a misreading of what Bloomer is emphasizing in these premises. So what is he saying? What is he emphasizing in these premises? His premises of symbolic interactionism are that one, people act towards objects, events, and others based upon meaning. Same thing that I've been saying this entire time. No symbolic interactionist disagrees with that. There's no division there. It's just the idea that people are acting towards things not because, or not just because of their physical properties, but because of the meanings and therefore the associated expectations we have regarding those things. Second, meaning emerges through the course of social interaction. Meanings are created and recreated as actors respond to objects, events, and other actors and their behaviors, which means that meaning inherently, at least in origin, is rooted in behavior. Even if the behavior is getting you to think about a specific object in a specific way, it's having you think about that object relative to a potential behavior. Third premise is that meanings are subject to modification through self communication, you playing that communication game in your head, as individuals interpret and respond to the things they encounter or mentally generate in their encounter. Because of that, because meanings are modified through mental interaction and then actual interaction, meanings are things that evolve over time, right? The meaning of what it means to be a good American, what it means to be moral. These things evolve over time as based upon people's communications, interactions, and subsequent behaviors, we develop a refined understanding of what these significant symbols are indicating. The disagreement between the two related schools of thought within SI is traditional SI at least used to argue that because meanings are made in the course of interaction and they're modified in interaction, you can't use surveys because surveys are a series of pre-identified questions. And if meaning is made and remade in interaction, how can you capture that meaning through an instrument that makes a priori assumptions about what is going to be happening? It's an understandable argument to a degree, but here's the thing. Like survey research and structural SI is not saying that it's able to perfectly determine that meaning interpretation process within an interaction, nor is it denying that the meaning making in interaction is essential to understanding behavior. Rather, it is arguing that there are stable patterns that can empirically be demonstrated to have an effect on how people are interpreting things. It's not claiming that it's predeterministic. It's claiming that through gathering large amounts of data about social structures, we're able to then understand how individuals might be ordering the meanings they do generate within interactions, which has empirically been demonstrated. Um, so one school would argue that you can't fundamentally study interaction in the self and subsequent behaviors if you're not observing the actual interactions themselves, because that is where meaning is created and recreated. Another school would say that is essential to do. However, it's also important to understand that even though people create and recreate meanings in interactions, not every meaning combination is equal probable in an interaction, as demonstrated by the fact that there are pattern sets of behaviors in interactions. And so, if there is some degree of stability with these meanings, that likely indicates that there are components of the social environment that are causing this stability. I hope that that made a little bit of sense, but if not, again, this is me trying to expand upon what the book is saying. And if you have any questions about it, please just reach out to me and I'd be happy to clarify things even further. So we're almost to the point where we will be talking now about this division within symbolic interactionism, but let's wrap up by talking about, actually, no, I was going to skip ahead. Uh, Anyway, before we start talking about the traditional school of symbolic interactionism, which there wouldn't have been a division at that point when the traditional school emerged, let's talk about this idea of the social construction of reality. So, from the SI perspective, individuals are active participants in their everyday realities. Individuals' interactions with others constantly involve the continuous mental construction and then interactional negotiation of reality based upon how individuals interpret situations, how they're viewing themselves in these situations, how they're viewing others in these situations, and fundamentally, how they choose to then act in these situations based upon their understanding. In this way, symbolic interactionism emphasizes agency, individuals' capacity to act in a self directed manner. An individual chooses behaviors. They have the potential to produce, reproduce, or alter social structures through their understanding of meaning and through their understanding of how to act upon that meaning with a specific goal in mind. And so while emphasizing agency, SI researchers do recognize that social structure shapes people's social experiences by making it more or less likely that certain individuals will interact at particular points in time. And that is the idea of how society shapes self, shapes interaction, and then it just continues on in a circle. Is the idea that while individuals create and recreate meaning in situations, the probability of finding yourself in any specific situation is a product of larger, stable social structures. Traditional SI focuses on the meaning making and interpretation within situations. The structural school, the Indiana school, focuses on those factors that shape the context the individual finds themselves in. So, with that said, let's talk about the traditional school within symbolic interactionism. This is also known as the Chicago School of Symbolic Interactionism. Okay. So, the Chicago School of Symbolic Interactionism is associated with the work of a number of individuals from the University of Chicago. It is the one that is less structural in terms of its focus. It is not focusing on what are these factors that shape the context that individuals find themselves in, and more on how do individuals interpret a situation and then based upon meanings and expectations choose to behave. So what is distinctive about this school of SI, the Chicago school? It emphasizes situational definitions. It's emphasizing that people's definition of the situation shapes their response. As such, you have to take into consideration how people are defining the situation in order to study human behavior. If you want to understand why a human behaves in a certain way, you need to understand how people are defining a situation. Later, we would be thinking, all right, well, what factors shape the probability of finding oneself in a specific situation, or shape the probability of you thinking of it as a certain situation. But the Chicago school has focused itself on the fact that people do define situations in specific ways, and that if you want to actually understand behavior, you have to understand this process of situational definition. And so it focuses on how people construct meaning through interaction. We'll be going through some examples here in a minute, especially the Karp and Yoles study. I don't think that we're going to be bringing up Becker's study of marijuana users, although that was an interesting study that basically says how do people learn to experience marijuana as enjoyable, considering that it takes you out of biological equilibrium if this your if it's your first time smoking. And the argument is, well, there are other people likely in the situation that help them understand and contextualize what they're feeling and how they should be feeling about how they're feeling. How should you feel about these bodily experiences that you're having in response to this drug, and then how should you act based upon that? So, because it's very focused on situational definitions and how people construct meaning in actual interaction, it is not surprising that the Chicago school focuses on the use of qualitative methods such as participant observation, in depth interviews. Although I personally would argue that if you're getting real classic SI, interviews are not appropriate because with interviews, you're taking someone out of the situation that you're trying to study. And the only real way to get at the actual situation is with participant observation. But the big reason why we're doing this is because with qualitative methods, you're able to use a grounded theory approach, which is you're going to let the data speak for themselves. Your goal is to allow a broad collection of data to then inductively build up to theory rather than already having a theory you want to test. Because if you already have a theory you want to test, then you're not going to be open to how people are creating meanings in the situation. You're trying to test a pre-existing understanding of the situation, which doesn't really, you know, prominently focus on the actual meaning creation in the situation itself. So, in order to focus on this meaning creation, in order to study meaning creation related to situational definitions, qualitative methods have been traditionally used within the Chicago school. So let's go through a couple of slides with examples of research within the Chicago school. So we have Karp and Yule's Symbolic Interactionist Study of College Classrooms. This was from 1976, and they used non-participant observations, so they weren't interacting with students. They were trying to avoid interacting with students. They were more just sitting, observing, taking notes, and then later they rounded things out with a survey to collect data on the social construction of meaning within a classroom. So this is what we find from that study. From their notes, from all their observations in the survey, we found that professors viewed the classroom as a place for the discussion of ideas, and they define the situation as one where high levels of engagement are appropriate. So we have a set of meanings for the situation, and now we have a set of behavioral expectations. The situation, based upon meanings, is defined as one where engagement is appropriate, and therefore the professor is expecting engagement. Students define the classroom as a setting where information is given to them by the professor rather than created by them. They see themselves as idea seekers, not as active participants, and in fact, talking too much was a violation of classroom norms. So the situation has been defined where they're receiving information based upon various meanings in the situation, based upon meanings associated with their position as student, the professor's position as professor, and this shapes their behavior. Same situation, different definitions of the situation based upon different interpretation of meaning in the situation, which ultimately results in different behavioral expectations in interaction. So professors and students also had different views about the reasons for lack of participation. Professors assumed students didn't speak because they didn't want to look dumb in front of their peers. This was the professor trying to engage in this, complex thought, trying to get behind the eyes of the students, but because of a limited understanding of how the student was thinking, and because uh, complex thought and interaction always involves the interpretation of meaning, the professor, it doesn't seem like, actually got into the mindset of the students and was thinking about the situation from their perspective the same way they were. Because students list lack of preparation, they hadn't done the reading, as the main reason for participating. So professors, if they wanted to go ahead and change the situation, if they wanted to change the behavioral outcome, they would try and do things to make the situation more open and welcoming so that you wouldn't have to worry about feeling dumb. But if students aren't talking because they didn't do the preparation, making the situation more comfortable is only going to have a very limited effect on changing the behavior. So continuing on with the Cap and Yule's study, they found that in each class they observed, there were a few students, less than 10%, who participated, typically by answering questions posed by the professor. The non-talkers knew they could count on these students to talk. So this led to this idea, which could later be crystallized in a theory and then empirically tested, called the constellation of responsibility. Non-talkers knew they could count on the less than 10% of students who did participate to engage and hold the professor's mind adequately. And so the consolidation of responsibility, combined with the fact that students viewed professors as the provider of knowledge, made discussion within classrooms unlikely. So again, this is how you inductively build up to theory. You have observations, you notice patterns within these observations. Now you try and codify a general um, prediction of how something shapes the social world in a stable fashion. And then ideally you would continue on by testing whether this theory holds true in a number of situations. Let's talk about a second study, just briefly. Let's talk about the Ferris study of fan celebrity encounters. Okay. So in 2001, Ferris analyzed fan celebrity encounters based on data gathered using participant observation and in depth interviews. So there won't be so much with those in depth interviews, meaning creation in the situation that he's looking at, but he's more trying to get into the mindset of the participants to understand how might they have arrived at their interpretation of meaning in the situation that they did. So, the findings of this study were that fans desire interactions with celebrities. Some fans went to great length to make contact. They followed celebrities from pre staged events and planned public appearances, such as conventions, to other places. However, celebrities, they found, demand that their privacy be respected. When overzealous fans seek out celebrity contact in public settings, celebrities often get angry. Sometimes they experience fear. So we definitely have a different understanding of what this interaction is. One group perceives this interaction as positive and desirable, and the other seems to view it as negative and confrontational. So, from the perspective of fans, because of their understanding of the situation, their behavior is not problematic and the celebrity has nothing to worry about because they're viewing the situation primarily through their own eyes, even when they're trying to imagine themselves through the eye of the celebrity. From the perspective of the celebrities, this kind of pursuit of interaction can be seen as threatening to their security and can be potentially defined as stalking. And because there's not clear communication and understanding here, whenever you have a degree of uncertainty, it's easier to go ahead, especially in this situation, and assign a negative threatening definition to the situation. And because there's different definitions of the situation between fans and celebrities, we often have we can have conflict in terms of behaviors and extreme cases stalking to where one group wants one thing, another group wants one thing. Their understanding of this interaction situation are not aligning. There's considerable difference. And because of that, we have a conflict of outcomes. So this is all operating within the Chicago school. We're looking at how meanings, including the our understanding of meanings in the situation, how these shape behaviors. Now, let's round out this lesson. Yeah, we only have 4 more slides. So we'll round out this lesson by talking about the Iowa Indiana School of Symbolic Interactionism. So this is the structural side of the house. Okay. The Iowa and Structural School of Symbolic Interactionism places a greater emphasis on social structure than the Chicago School. I want to say Kuhn was definitely Iowa, and then Stryker put out his treatise, I want to say after a lot of Kuhn's work. Stryker's the one who coined the term structural symbolic interactionism, and he's the one who wrote the treatise in 1980, um, social symbolic interactionism, a social structural variant, which outlines a lot of the principles of structural symbolic interactionism. So whenever you hear the Iowa or the Indiana School of Symbolic Interactionism, that is the structural side of the house. This school, in many ways, because it's focusing on social structure, shares a good bit in common with the social structure and personality phase of social psychology, but it's within the framework of symbolic interactionism because it's placing so much emphasis on the self. It's emphasizing that the self is still key to determining behavior. We are just trying to understand the ways in which the self, as this reflective and agentic component of the individual's totality, um, is shaped by stable patterns that that self is enmeshed with. So theorists from within this school focus on the content of someone's self concept. Traditional SI is focusing on how behaviors are shaped on by self and interpretations that the self has of the situation. Structural side is focused on how are the properties of the self and specifically the self concept shaped by stable structural factors. So what is self concept? The self concept is a component of the self. There are many components of the self. The self concept is this idea that within the self, you attribute various characteristics, thoughts, and feelings to yourself. When you're reflecting on who you are and likely how others see you in a situation, that mental image that you make of yourself, even if it's just like a mental image of, I'm imagining myself as good. You don't have to imagine yourself as like glowing with, a holy light, but mentally, that picture of yourself, that abstract picture of yourself is painted with the color good. Okay. It's painted with the color intelligent. It's painted with the color of helpful, right? This set of characteristic thoughts and feelings that you attribute to yourself. Structural symbolic interactionism is interested in the statuses you occupy and how they relate to the content of your self concept. So let's think about this. If your self concept is things like, I'm moral, I'm good, I'm an American, I am a son, I am a student, I am a professor, you know, these characteristics, these thoughts, these feelings you have about yourself, they're partially tied to positions you occupy. So if I think of myself as intelligent, helpful, expected to communicate with people who are known as students, expected to provide information to those who seek my knowledge, then I'm likely going to think of myself as a professor. But I'm likely to think about myself as professor because I do things like get paid by Kent State to teach in a classroom. So they examine the link between your position within a society, your various positions, and how you come to think of yourself, because how you think about yourself is going to shape how you subsequently interact. So, as I've been saying, the self is viewed as reflecting society. Now, because of this principle that self reflects society, and because society is relatively stable, and able to be quantitatively measured, the argument then goes that you can measure the self much as you measure society because it is relatively stable and measurable. It's not saying that you can reliably measure the interaction that self engages in and how that self interprets a specific set of meanings in a specific situation, but rather you're able to measure the general content of the self, especially whenever it comes to components within the self like identities. Specifically, which identity is more salient to you? Which identity are you more likely to enact, all else being equal? Student or athlete? Are you going to enact whenever you're at a family gathering and your brother's there and you're friendly with your brother, but you're also in a family gathering where you're expected to be a family member? What set of meanings are you going to act upon in that situation? But based upon this principle that self-reflects society, that society is relatively stable and measurable, you should be able to measure at least some components of the self using the same sort of quantitative instruments that you'd use to measure society, because the self should be relatively stable and measurable. And in many ways, this does play out. So let me give you an example now of something very, very not key, not foundational, but very useful in understanding the framework that is structural symbolic interactionism. So we have this thing called the 20 statements test. And this was like a rough way of measuring components of the self concept. So the 20 statements test is used to measure the self concept. Here's how it works. You give a student 20 lines, 20 blank lines, and then you give them these instructions. There are 20 numbered blanks on the page below. I recommend you do this yourself, by the way. It's really interesting to see what you put. You have 20 blanks below. Please write 20 answers to this question. Who am I? You're not going to get any clarification on that. That is the question. You have to interpret it. Who am I? Write your answers in the blank. We just want 20 different answers to this question. Answer as if you're giving the answer to yourself, not somebody else. You don't have to explain this to anyone. You're just writing this list for you. Write the answers in the order that they occur. Don't worry about logic, don't worry about importance, and go fast. Don't debate your cuts. I'm taking this page away from you in 60 seconds. Don't screw around, don't antagonize, just go. Who am I? And the best way to do this is start each response statement with I am a student. I am kind. I am a Christian. I am a professor. I am a husband. I am a uh, son. I am a employee. I am a symbolic interactionist. I am a brother. I am a brother-in-law. I am a person who is very hungry. I am a good person. I am a tired person. I am addicted to caffeine. Um, all of these were correct answers to the question, who am I? So we're getting at these meaning sets within the self-concept, right? Students commonly respond to that 20 statement test by listing statuses that indicate the statuses and roles they occupy. That is the one of the biggest words that come out of this, okay? Roles. Roles. People list statuses, but people list who they are by the statuses they occupy, which means the roles associated with those statuses. So what does this say? People's self-concept is shaped by the statuses they occupy, which serve as sources of identities. What are identities? They're often thought of as stable meanings and associated behavioral expectations within the self as part of the self concept that are tied often, but not always, to known social positions or roles. Roles are often thought of in terms of I have like it's roles are always I have a set of meanings and expectations associate because I occupy this designated and named position within a larger collective group. Identities are a bit broader than roles. Identities include roles, but they can also um, be broader or more narrow than that. But anyway, back to the 20 statements test. Research using the 20 statements test in college student populations finds that college students who belong to unconventional religious groups are more likely than students who participate in mainstream denominations to list their religion as one of their first responses. Female and minority students are more likely to list their gender or race than their counterparts. Hey, I didn't list being white or being a man whenever I was going through mine really fast, right? The interesting thing is that, and this is where this next slide will come in, kind of. Stryker's focus within structural symbolic interactionism is all right, so within the self concept, some people are more likely to mention their gender just at all than other people. And we find that there's a pattern in that. So, what is causing this pattern within the self? Because the pattern within the self is going to shape behavior. If you're thinking of yourself as a man, you're going to be more likely to act upon those meanings in a situation. But what causes you to be prominently thinking about yourself in that way? Elements of social structure. So let's wrap up. Well, there's a short image that we'll wrap up with, but this is the last slide with text on it. So let's wrap up talking about the Indiana and Iowa School of Symbolic Interactionism by talking about society, the self-concept, and behavior. So the Iowa-Indiana School, the Structural School of Symbolic Interactionism, focuses on how self-concept shapes behavior, and specifically how social structure shapes self-concept structure. So identity theory, it's calling it Stryker's identity theory here because there's also things like place identity and not structural identity theory, social identity theory, which is more a psychological social psychology framework or theory, sorry. But Stryker's, so just identity theory emphasizes the relationship between people's statuses, the content of their self concept, and how they choose to act in various situations. How individuals view themselves affects the kind of social encounters they seek out. This means that measuring the content of the self concept can be used to a degree to predict patterns of behavior. And identity theorists have also studied the ways emotions help people maintain consistency between their self concept and behavior. That had to be included in there because the perceptual, what do we call it? I just call it the perceptual side of the house in identity theory. The perceptual is that word. One second, I got to figure out what this word is. Paradigm. Paradigm is the word I'm trying to say. Within identity theory, we used to more clearly denote that we had various paradigms within the framework. One of those paradigms was perceptual control, which talks about what this final bullet point did, which is identity theory is studying the way emotions help people maintain consistency between self-concept and behavior. Um, I personally have always been more interested in how people's self-concept, so your likelihood to think of yourself as a son, as a brother, as a uh, professor, as a whatever in any given situation is shaped by the social structures that you find yourself in. And not just like, am I a son, but what is the likelihood of me acting upon that set of meanings and expectations of being a son rather than acting on the meanings and expectations of just, being a friend um, or something more general like being an American. The classic Stryker thought experiment with this is why does one man go to his kid's little league game on a free weekend while someone else completely similar in all other ways. No, sorry. Why does one man spend his free weekend um, hanging out with his buddies golfing, while another man spends his free weekend um, at his kid's little league game? Right? Why does one man who's a father hang out with his buddies on the weekend? Why does another man who's a father go to his kid's little league game? The argument is one man is more likely to think of himself as father, or father might be a more important identity to him, while the other man might be more likely to think of himself as friend or might put more value on being someone's friend or coworker. Now, why would this happen? Why might someone be find being a father more or less important than being a good coworker? Why would someone um, find being a father as more important than being a coworker to someone or being a good coworker compared to being a good father? Stryker's argument is it depends on the composition of one's social structure. If you're more interactively and affectively tied to your coworkers than, say, a group of parents or your child, then you're more likely to go golfing. And if you're more affectively and interactively connected to other parents than and your children than you are with your coworkers, then you're more likely to see yourself as a parent rather than a coworker in a given situation, and you'll uh, find that being seen as a parent is more important to you than being seen as a coworker, and so accordingly, you'll go to your kid's little league game rather than go to um, a golf outing with your friend. So in this way, understanding social arrangements, who you're affectively and interactively connected with, shapes how you're likely to think of yourself. Is being a father important to me? Am I likely to view any situation as appropriate to bring up the fact I'm a father, to act on those meanings? And then based upon that, how you think of yourself, that will have a predictive effect on how you're likely to act. So our summary image is this. Figure 3.3 in your book, the self-society relationship. In the Chicago School of SI, we're focusing more on the connection of how self shapes society through a set of processes by which people interpret meanings in a situation and then recreate those meaning through interactions, and through these interactions shape larger societal expectations. Whereas in the Indiana and Iowa school of symbolic interactionism, we're looking at how there are large social expectations and positional designations within society in the terms of roles in particular. Right? I have a role as a father, I have a role as a member of the sociology department. Based upon these arrangements of a society, I will then have my behavior shaped and my understanding of how I should act in a given situation. All right, I went a little over than the 1 hour and 15 minutes I would like to limit this to in the future. That way I can keep my collective lectures down to 2.5 hours, which would be the amount of time we spend in class. So I'll end here. Thank you all very much for joining me on this lecture, and I will talk to you all later. Thank you very much.